All right, so now the ETC and chemiosmosis. Again, eukaryotes. All of these proteins are going to be bedded into the inner membrane, which is the cristae of the mitochondria. In the prokaryotes, all of these things are in um, the inner membrane of the plasma membrane. So a lot of times our prokaryotes actually have two membranes in there. So that's what's going to happen with the prokaryotes. And that's just on the outside plasma membrane, as we talked about. All right, so let's look at the picture here just so we're clear. Down here, this liquid space here, this is the matrix. That's the very inside of the mitochondria. We have the inner mitochondrial membrane, right? That's a phospholipid bilayer with proteins in it. And then the outside is the inner membrane space. So we're going to be going from the matrix to the space, as you can see, or from the space to the matrix. So as we follow along, that's the picture we're talking about here. So ATP is going to be made by the ETC when NADH and FADH2 release their hydrogen atoms. And now we're making NAD plus and FAD, right? So here we go. Whoop, whoop. And what comes off? Oh, those hydrogen ions are coming off. So now they're in the matrix. And then what is the NADH giving? Electrons, right, to the ETC. So the electrons, right? It's called an electron transport chain because we're going to take two electrons off and the proteins are going to transport them through all of their proteins. Right? So we're transporting these electrons through the proteins. And then what happens is after you get to the end, where did the electrons go? That's the question. Where did the electrons go? Well, it turns out that the electrons are going to find the oxygen that we're breathing in, and that oxygen is going to find two hydrogen ions, and it's going to accept those electrons, which will help it bond to those two hydrogen ions, and it will make water. So we're doing the opposite. Remember, in photosynthesis, we split water into oxygen and hydrogen. Now we're going to give it electrons and make water. So we're doing the opposite of photosynthesis here. And remember that the NADH and the FADH2s, I should say 2 up there, are releasing hydrogen ions. The energy produced in the ETC is used to actively transport the hydrogen ions from the mitochondrial matrix to the space. So remember that active transport is going from low concentration to high concentration. So we're going to pump, right? We have to use energy to make it go from low to high, low to high. So that's why we're having this whole thing, because we're going to pump out these hydrogen ions across to the inner membrane space. And now what's going to happen? Oh, we have a high concentration. And now that these hydrogen ions that have a high concentration are going to diffuse, or without energy, just naturally travel through our ATP synthase. And then what are we going to see happening? We're going to be making ATP. Remember, that's called chemiosmosis. That's what we're doing. So this picture is the same. It's kind of flipped, right? It's kind of backwards, the one we saw with photosynthesis, but it's still the same concept. So this is all in detail, where we're going through our ETC, chemiosmosis. This whole thing is called oxidative phosphorylation. All right, oxidative phosphorylation just means we're using oxygen to make ATP. And again, just remembering where we are in the mitochondria, and the matrix, this space. The matrix, the space. So why do we need oxygen? Well, oxygen is the final electron acceptor. It accepts electrons from the ETC. So if I take away oxygen, and there is nothing to collect the electrons, then basically everything backs up, because the two electrons will just sit here, and then the two behind, and the two behind, the two behind. And then the NADH will have nothing to take, like this protein will be full of electrons, so it's not going to take those electrons, so nothing happens. And so everything sits there, just like, oh, we're stopped. We're in a traffic jam. We're in a traffic jam because we have nothing at the end. So they're just hanging out, stopped, can't keep going unless you have oxygen. So that's why oxygen is important for this process. We need the oxygen to come in, take those electrons, and keep the train going. All right. Now let's talk about efficiency and also what really happens here. So when we look at this, we broke down glucose, we made 2 ATP. Boom. Then we went through the citric acid cycle, we also make 2 ATP. Okay. Now, when we actually go through oxidative phosphorylation, we make 34 ATP. Just all those electrons going through, because look at all the electrons we're kind of bringing into this whole situation, and hydrogen ions. So this is like very good process, makes lots and lots and lots of ATP. So our total, notice it says about, our total is about 38. About, because, it doesn't always work out perfectly like this number. This is just the number we have. 34 plus 2 plus 2, we're going to say 38. So when we talk about energy, so that glucose molecule comes with so much energy. And when we break down that glucose molecule and we're thinking about, is that how much energy was really in that glucose molecule, that 38 ATP? Well, no, not really. It's really only we're only getting 40% of the energy that glucose molecule technically had. But this is way better than glycolysis, right? Glycolysis only gave us 2 ATP, and we're getting 36 more in doing aerobic respiration. So it's like 20 times better. The other thing that and this probably comes into maybe the idea of keto diets and stuff, we don't necessarily have to have glucose, but glucose is really the main thing that we use. That's what our bodies and our cells is meant to break down. So that's what it does first. But lipids, fats, and also proteins can enter into the citric acid cycle and be broken down to go into the citric acid cycle and to make ATP. So our cells are able to break down other things besides glucose. And usually, though, that is the last thing it will do. It will do the last. So this is when you're talking about if you were, trapped in an earthquake somewhere for 2 weeks, as long as you had water, your body, if it didn't have sugar available, can look for other parts of your body, right? Can look for fat. Remember, fat is like a storage. It's supposed to be a storage for future use. So your body could then go to that fat and then make ATP, or can go to the proteins, which means it breaks down your muscle, which is very common when you are starving for your body to start breaking down your muscles. Again, to make ATP and to keep you alive. So other things can make ATP, but your body does this first. It always breaks down the sugar first. Only when it's out of sugar is it going to look for fats and proteins. All right, so just remember, thinking back to glycolysis. Glycolysis only gave us 2 ATP, so it's really a 2% effective rate. And that's fine if you are a unicellular organism. If you only have one cell, 2 ATP is fine. But if you are, and even maybe the small multicellular organisms can live that way, but the rest of us, we cannot live on glycolysis alone. We really need aerobic respiration. Your brain only survives 6 minutes without oxygen. So for 6 minutes, no oxygen, you're making 2 ATP, your brain cells are still functioning, but after 6 minutes, it's not enough ATP to keep your brain cell functioning, and your brain cell dies. And then you overall will die if your brain is dead, right? So that's the concept of oxygen and how we need oxygen. And without oxygen, we're not making enough ATP. We don't have ATP. We're just not going to be alive. Our cells are going to die, and then the whole body dies. So again, glucose, glycolysis, 2 ATP, make pyruvic acid. Little or no oxygen present, we're going to go into anaerobic respiration. An means no, no air. That's what this really means, no air. No air respiration. So no air respiration, we have fermentation, that's not making any ATP, and we are creating these waste products, lactic acid and ethanol. We're only getting 2 ATP out of that glucose that we got. But we could also do, with oxygen present, aerobic respiration, air respiration. And now we're going to have the citric acid cycle. It's going to make us 2 ATP, and oxidative phosphorylation will make us 34. So 2 plus 2 plus 34 is 38. And then I'll have you watch this video so that if it will help kind of show you the whole picture and kind of see that how that all works. So that is cellular respiration. And that is the end of our unit.